The envelope felt heavier than it should have. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes stood in the gravel driveway of his family's ranch, morning sun beating down on his shoulders, staring at the certified letter that had just been hand-delivered by a nervous-looking courier. The return address made his jaw tighten. Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. He opened it carefully, the way he'd been trained to handle everything, methodically, prepared for what might come next. Notice of violation and demand for immediate compliance. Dear property owner, it has come to the attention of the Pinewood Estates HOA board that unauthorized structures exist on community property, specifically one dilapidated barn, circa 1950s, on unpermitted equipment shed, and livestock fencing extending beyond approved boundaries. You are hereby ordered to remove all structures within 72 hours, or face legal action including fines of $500 per day and forced removal at owner's expense. Signed, Richard Caldwell, HOA President. Daniel read it 3 times. Then he walked to the barn in question, the one his grandfather had built, with his own hands in 1952, on land that had been in the Hayes family since 1887, the same barn where his father had taught him to ride at age 5, the same property line that had existed decades before. Pinewood Estates was even a concept in some developers' portfolio. The problem wasn't that the letter was aggressive. The problem was that it was completely demonstrably wrong. His property wasn't part of the HOA. It never had been. It never would be. But as Daniel looked across the fence line toward the cookie cutter houses of Pinewood Estates, their manicured lawns and identical mailboxes gleaming in the morning light, he understood something with the clarity that only comes from experience. This wasn't about property lines. This was about power, and someone had just made a serious miscalculation. The Hayes Ranch had been quiet for 6 months. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when the man who gave it life is gone. Daniel's father, Robert Hayes, had died of a heart attack 14 months earlier, while Daniel was on his 3rd deployment in the Middle East. The Red Cross message had reached him in a forward operating base outside Kandahar. By the time he'd made it home, the funeral was over. His father was buried next to his mother and grandfather in the small cemetery at the edge of town, beneath an oak tree that had stood for over a century. The ranch had waited for him. 80 acres of Texas scrubland, with a 2-bedroom house built in 1920, the barn his grandfather had raised, a smaller equipment shed, and paddocks for the 3 horses his father had kept. It wasn't much by modern standards, but it was everything to the Hayes family. Daniel had grown up here, learned to shoot, ride, and work the land. His father had been a Vietnam veteran, Marines 2 tours, who'd come home and poured everything into making the ranch a place of peace. War teaches you what matters, Robert used to say. Family, land, honor, everything else is just noise. When Daniel enlisted at 18, his father had been proud. 12 years later, Daniel had earned his rank through deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified operations he couldn't discuss. He'd led men through firefights, navigated complex tribal politics, and made decisions that meant life or death. Coming home had been the plan. The ranch was supposed to be his fresh start, a return to the values his father had instilled. No more convoys, no more mortars, just honest work, open sky, and the legacy of good men who'd built something that mattered. Pinewood Estates had other ideas. The development had started 5 years ago while Daniel was still overseas. A massive suburban project, 300 homes, community pools, walking trails, and strict architectural guidelines. It had consumed farmland and open range, replacing it with identical 2-story houses priced for Austin commuters looking for small-town charm with modern amenities. The development stopped exactly at the Hayes property line, or it was supposed to. Daniel had noticed small things when he first returned. Survey stakes near his fence, fresh tire tracks on the access road that ran along his northern boundary. A few polite letters from the HOA asking if he'd be interested in selling. He'd ignored them. The property wasn't for sale, and he had no interest in joining an organization that fined people for the wrong shade of fence paint. Then the letters changed. First came the friendly reminders about community standards. His gravel driveway was visually inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. His work truck, a beat-up F-250 he used for ranch work, violated commercial vehicle restrictions. His horses fences were too close to the property line and created odor concerns. Daniel responded professionally each time, attaching copies of his property survey, county records, and a polite explanation that his land predated the HOA and wasn't subject to their rules. That's when Richard Caldwell got involved personally. Richard Caldwell was exactly the kind of man who thrived in positions of small, unchecked authority. Mid-50s real estate background with a smile that never quite reached his eyes and a handshake that lasted 2 seconds too long. He'd been elected HOA president on a platform of preserving property values and had run the organization like a personal fiefdom ever since. Their first face-to-face meeting happened on a Saturday morning when Caldwell showed up at Daniel's gate with 2 board members in tow. "Mr. Hayes, we need to discuss your compliance issues," Caldwell said, not bothering with pleasantries. "There are no compliance issues," Daniel replied evenly. "My property isn't part of your HOA." "That's debatable. The property line has been disputed for years, and we have documentation. The property line isn't disputed. I have 3 independent surveys, county records going back to 1887, and a title that's crystal clear. You're welcome to review them." Caldwell's smile tightened. "I don't think you understand the situation. This community has standards. Your rustic aesthetic is affecting property values for your neighbors. We're prepared to be reasonable, but you need to work with us." Daniel met his eyes with the same calm. He'd used facing down hostile foreign officials. "I've worked with you. I've answered every letter. I've provided documentation. What you're asking for isn't cooperation. It's submission to authority. You don't have." The board members shifted uncomfortably. Caldwell's face reddened. "We'll see about that, Mr. Hayes. We'll see about that." The campaign started small and grew systematically worse. Code enforcement officers appeared at Daniel's property twice in 1 week, responding to anonymous complaints. His horses were allegedly too close to residential areas, never mind that they'd been there for 30 years. His barn needed permits for structural modifications that had been completed in 1952. Each citation was professionally refuted. Daniel kept meticulous records, photographed everything, and responded with the kind of detailed precision he'd learned writing military reports. Each refutation seemed to infuriate Caldwell more. Then the HOA filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming Daniel's property constituted a public nuisance. The complaint alleged health code violations, zoning infractions, and environmental concerns. All of it was fabricated. All of it required Daniel's time and money to disprove. The county inspector, who eventually visited, was apologetic. "Mr. Hayes, I'm required to investigate, but between you and me, this is harassment. Your property is cleaner than most suburban homes I inspect. Someone's got it out for you." "I know," Daniel said quietly. The inspector lowered his voice. "Word of advice? Get a lawyer. This kind of thing doesn't stop on its own." But Daniel had been trained to understand his adversary's psychology. Caldwell wasn't just about winning, he was about domination. Lawyers would only escalate the conflict into expensive legal warfare that could drag on for years. No, this required a different approach. Then Caldwell crossed the line, literally. Daniel returned from a VA appointment on a Wednesday afternoon to find a construction crew on his property. They were building a fence, chain link 6 feet high, running straight across his northern pasture, right through land his family had owned for over a century. He parked the truck and walked over, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. The crew boss, a weathered man in his 50s, looked up nervously. "Help you?" the man asked. "That's my property you're building on," Daniel said evenly. "Got a work order from the HOA, says this is the correct property line. It's not. You're 15 feet onto my land." The crew boss pulled out a folded map. "This is what we were given. Look, buddy, I just do what I'm told. You got a problem. Take it up with whoever hired us." Daniel photographed everything: the fence, the crew, the work order, the survey map they'd been given. Then he called the county sheriff's office and requested an officer for a property dispute. By the time Deputy Martinez arrived, the crew had stopped working, sensing trouble. Martinez reviewed Daniel's survey documents, looked at the HOA's map, and shook his head. "Mr. Hayes is correct. This fence is on his property. You'll need to stop construction immediately." The crew boss called Caldwell. Daniel could hear the raised voice on the other end of the line, even from 10 feet away. Finally, the crew boss hung up and turned to his men. "Pack it up, we're done here." But the fence posts remained, driven into Daniel's soil like a declaration of war. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and did what he'd been trained to do: gather intelligence. In the army, every successful operation started with understanding the enemy, their capabilities, motivations, weaknesses, and patterns. Caldwell had shown his hand with the fence. He was willing to break the law, forge documents, and use intimidation. That spoke to someone who believed he was untouchable. Daniel started with public records. HOA financial statements were required to be available to homeowners, and while he wasn't an HOA member, many documents were filed with the county. What he found was interesting. Over the past 3 years, Pinewood Estates had spent nearly $400,000 on landscape improvements and community enhancements. But when Daniel cross-referenced the payments against actual work visible in the neighborhood, the numbers didn't match. The contracts had all gone to 3 companies: Greenscape Solutions, Community First Landscaping, and Texas Property Services. He dug deeper. All 3 companies had been registered within the past 4 years. All 3 listed the same registered agent, and that agent, a business attorney who also happened to represent Richard Caldwell's personal real estate ventures. Daniel leaned back in his chair, pieces falling into place. This wasn't just about harassing a neighbor. Caldwell was running a fraud scheme, overcharging the HOA for services, funneling money through shell companies, and pocketing the difference. Daniel's refusal to comply, his documentation, his unwillingness to be intimidated, it all threatened to draw scrutiny to Caldwell's operation. The fence wasn't about property lines. It was about silencing someone who might expose the whole corrupt system. Daniel smiled grimly. He'd dealt with warlords running protection rackets in Afghanistan. Richard Caldwell was small-time by comparison, but unlike Afghanistan, this was America. And in America there were rules Daniel knew how to use. The next morning, Daniel made 4 phone calls. First, to a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. He scheduled a consultation and sent over all his documentation. Second, to a surveying company. He ordered a comprehensive boundary survey, certified by 3 independent firms, with every measurement documented and notarized. Third, to a local news station. He explained the situation to their investigative team: military veteran, family ranch, HOA harassment, illegal fence construction. They were interested. Fourth, to the district attorney's office. He submitted a formal complaint about potential HOA financial fraud, attaching his research on the shell companies and requesting investigation. Then he installed security cameras, military-grade equipment, motion-activated with cloud backup. Every inch of his property line was now under surveillance. He also did something his father had taught him. He called his neighbors, not the Pinewood Estates residents, the old-timers, the ranchers and farmers who'd been there before the development. People who remembered Robert Hayes and respected the family name. They remembered, and several of them had their own complaints about Caldwell's pressure tactics and attempts to expand HOA authority beyond its legal boundaries. Within a week, Daniel had something Caldwell had never expected: a coalition. The story hit the local news on a Friday evening. HOA president targets veteran on family land was the headline. The reporter had done her homework, interviewing Daniel on his property, filming the illegal fence posts still embedded in his pasture, and reviewing the documentation of harassment. But she'd also found something Daniel hadn't: other victims. 3 other property owners bordering Pinewood Estates had experienced similar pressure. One had sold their land at a loss just to escape the legal harassment. Another was still fighting. The third had simply given up and moved. The reporter connected it all: a pattern of intimidation, questionable financial dealings, and abuse of HOA authority for personal gain. The segment went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been shared thousands of times on social media. The phrase HOA tyrant started trending locally. News outlets from Austin and San Antonio picked up the story. Someone created a Facebook group called Pinewood Estates Accountability that grew to 400 members in 3 days. Many of them HOA residents who'd been quietly suffering under Caldwell's regime. The board of directors panicked. They released a statement distancing themselves from Caldwell's actions, claiming they'd been unaware of the fence incident. The county DA's office announced a formal investigation into HOA financial practices, and Richard Caldwell hired a a lawyer. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Daniel wasn't invited, but the news cameras were there. So were about 60 residents, many carrying signs. Fire Caldwell. Veterans deserve respect. End HOA corruption. Inside the community center, the meeting devolved into chaos within minutes. Residents demanded answers about the financial discrepancies Daniel's research had uncovered. They demanded accountability for the harassment of multiple property owners. They demanded Caldwell's resignation. Caldwell tried to maintain control, claiming everything was a misunderstanding, that Daniel was a troublemaker trying to avoid reasonable community standards. That's when one of the board members, a retired accountant named Margaret Chen, stood up with a folder of documents. "I've reviewed the financial records Mr. Hayes submitted to the DA," she said quietly. "I've also done my own analysis. Over the past 3 years, this HOA has overpaid for services by approximately $290,000. The companies receiving those payments are connected to President Caldwell's business interests. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is fraud." The room erupted. By the end of the meeting, Caldwell had been voted out by a margin of 6-1, with only his own vote in his favor. The board voted to cooperate fully with the DA's investigation and to issue a formal apology to Daniel Hayes and the other affected property owners. Caldwell left the building through a side door, surrounded by camera flashes and shouted questions. The legal proceedings took 6 months. Richard Caldwell was charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and filing false documents. The evidence was overwhelming: bank records, forged surveys, shell company registrations, and testimony from construction crews he'd directed to work on property he didn't own. He pleaded guilty to avoid trial and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, along with restitution payments totaling over $350,000 to the HOA and affected property owners. The shell companies were dissolved. The HOA implemented new financial oversight procedures. A new board was elected on a platform of transparency and respect for property rights. The fence posts were removed from Daniel's property professionally, extracted and disposed of at Caldwell's expense, paid through his insurance before he lost everything. 3 families who'd been pressured by Caldwell's tactics filed a class action lawsuit and won settlements. One family was able to buy back the property they'd been forced to sell. On a clear Saturday morning, 8 months after the certified letter arrived, Daniel stood in the same spot where it had all begun. The ranch was quiet again, the good kind of quiet. His horses grazed peacefully in the northern pasture, where the illegal fence had briefly stood. The barn his grandfather built still stood solid, just as it had for over 70 years. The equipment shed his father had maintained was freshly painted, because Daniel had the time now, time not spent fighting frivolous legal battles. The property line was exactly where it had always been, marked now by a new fence Daniel had built himself, placed precisely on his land with no ambiguity. In the distance, Pinewood Estates continued its suburban existence, but the relationship had changed. The new HOA board had sent a formal letter of apology and an invitation to a community barbecue, which Daniel had politely declined. Though he appreciated the gesture, he didn't need to be part of their community. He had his own. Deputy Martinez stopped by that afternoon, off duty, just to check in. "How you holding up, Daniel?" "Good, peaceful." Martinez smiled. "You know, a lot of folks would have just sold the place. Easier than fighting." Daniel looked across the land his great-grandfather had claimed, his grandfather had built, and his father had loved. "This isn't just property," he said quietly. "It's legacy. My family stood their ground for over a century. I wasn't about to be the one who gave it up to a bully with a title and no honor. Your father would have been proud. He taught me everything I needed: discipline, patience, and that real strength isn't about force. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for and having the integrity to do it right." Martinez nodded, understanding. "Well, the whole county's talking about it. You've become something of a local legend." Daniel laughed softly. "I'm just a guy trying to keep his family's ranch running. Maybe, but you reminded people that power without honor is just tyranny. And tyranny doesn't last when good people stand up." After Martinez left, Daniel walked to the small family cemetery at the edge of the property. He stood at his father's grave beneath the old oak and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. "We held the line, Dad," he said softly, "just like you taught me." The wind moved moved through the oak's branches, carrying the scent of grass and earth and home. 3 months later, Daniel was invited to speak at the county veterans meeting. He almost declined, but the organizer was persistent. People want to hear from you. What you did mattered. So he went, and at the end of the meeting, during the open discussion, a young veteran recently returned from deployment asked him a question. How did you know it would work out? How did you know you'd win? Daniel considered his answer carefully. I didn't know I'd win, he said honestly, but I knew what I was fighting for, and I knew I was in the right. The army taught me that the most powerful weapon isn't firepower, it's discipline. Knowing your objective, understanding your enemy, gathering intelligence, and executing with precision. He paused, looking around the room at the faces of men and women who'd served. Caldwell thought power came from his position, from fear and intimidation and being willing to break rules because he didn't think anyone would hold him accountable. But real strength comes from something deeper: integrity, discipline, and respect for the law. When you have those things, when you stand on solid ground, literally and figuratively, you don't have to be the loudest or the most aggressive. You just have to be right and patient and willing to see it through. An older veteran in the back raised his hand. What would you say to someone facing something similar? Maybe not an HOA, but any kind of abuse of power. Daniel thought about his father, about the lessons learned in dusty fobs and on this ranch, about the difference between force and strength. Document everything. Know your rights. Don't fight emotion with emotion. Fight it with facts. And remember that people who abuse power do it because they think they're untouchable. The moment you prove they're not, the moment you shine a light on what they're doing, their whole system falls apart. He smiled slightly. Also, underestimating honorable people is always a mistake. We might be quiet, we might be patient, but we don't quit and we don't compromise our principles for convenience. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and it spread through the room. Not loud or showy, but genuine. That night, driving back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, Daniel thought about the journey. The certified letter that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago. He'd been trained for war, but peace had taught him something just as valuable: that the battles worth fighting aren't always the ones with guns. Sometimes they're fought with surveys and legal documents and the quiet determination to protect what matters. As he pulled into his driveway, the house lights glowing warm in the darkness, he felt something settle in his chest. This was home. This was worth protecting, and he had protected it, not with violence, but with the values his father had instilled and the discipline the army had refined. Real strength, he realized, was exactly what his father had always said: knowing when to hold the line. And Daniel had held his. The ranch was at peace. The legacy was secure, and somewhere he hoped his father was proud.